The first rays of sunlight barely pierced through Seattle's characteristic morning fog as Samuel Carter made his way through the towering stacks of shipping containers. At 5:30 a.m., the port was still sleeping, save for the occasional cry of seagulls and the gentle lapping of waves against the pier. This was his favorite time of day, when the world seemed to belong only to him and the elements. Samuel adjusted his hard hat and checked his clipboard, preparing for another day as operations supervisor at one of the East Coast's busiest ports. At 45, he had perfected his routine to the point where his colleagues often joked that you could set your watch by his movements. His salt and pepper hair and weather-worn face told the story of countless days spent under the open sky, managing the complex dance of machines and men that kept global commerce flowing. The morning fog created an almost mystical atmosphere, transforming the usually bustling port into a silent cathedral of steel and concrete. Samuel loved these quiet moments when he could inspect the grounds without interruption, ensuring everything was in perfect order before the day shift arrived. His footsteps echoed softly against the concrete as he made his methodical rounds. As he turned a corner between two towering stacks of containers, something caught his attention. A movement, subtle but distinct, drew his gaze upward. There, wedged between two containers, was a sight that made him stop in his tracks. A magnificent bald eagle, its brown feathers ruffled and its wing awkwardly positioned, was trapped in the narrow space. Samuel's heart raced as he assessed the situation. The bird's eyes met his, and in that moment, something profound passed between them. The eagle's gaze held both fierce pride and unmistakable distress. Its wing appeared to be injured, though Samuel couldn't tell how severely. Years of handling port emergencies had taught him to remain calm in crisis situations, but this was entirely different from anything in his experience. Port regulations strictly prohibited interference with wildlife, a policy Samuel had always enforced without question. The rules existed for good reasons: safety, liability, and the smooth operation of the facility. Yet as he stood there, watching the magnificent creature struggle to maintain its dignity despite its obvious pain, Samuel felt something shift inside him. He pulled out his phone and began searching for local wildlife experts. The port would be coming to life soon, and he knew he needed to act quickly. After several calls, he finally reached Dr. James Wilson, a wildlife veterinarian who specialized in treating birds of prey. The doctor's initial reluctance to come to the port without proper authorization melted away as Samuel described the eagle's condition with careful detail. While waiting for Dr. Wilson to arrive, Samuel maintained a respectful distance from the eagle, speaking to it in soft, reassuring tones. He noticed how the bird seemed to respond to his voice, its fierce eyes following his movements with intelligent interest rather than fear. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the eagle's majestic features. Its hooked beak, the intense yellow of its eyes, and the powerful talons that could easily tear through flesh. The sound of approaching footsteps made Samuel turn. Dr. Wilson had arrived, carrying a large case of equipment and wearing an expression that mixed professional concern with barely concealed excitement. In 20 years of practicing, I've never had to rescue an eagle from a container port, he remarked, carefully assessing the situation. Together, they worked out a plan to safely retrieve the injured bird. Samuel's knowledge of the port's layout and his calm presence proved invaluable as they carefully positioned themselves to reach the eagle. The rescue would be just the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would change not only Samuel's life, but the very essence of his relationship with the world around him. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the first shifts of workers began arriving, Samuel watched Dr. Wilson prepare his equipment. The port was awakening to its daily rhythm, but for Samuel, something profound had already shifted. In helping this majestic creature, he was about to step beyond the carefully ordered boundaries of his life into unknown territory. If this story has captured your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Let us know which city you're watching from. Now, let's continue. The rescue operation proved more challenging than either Samuel or Dr. Wilson had anticipated. The eagle, despite its injury, maintained its wild dignity, eyeing them with a mixture of wariness and what Samuel could have sworn was intelligence. Dr. Wilson explained in hushed tones that this was a female eagle, probably around 5 years old, judging by her plumage and size. "She's remarkable," the veterinarian whispered as he prepared a protective blanket. "Usually injured birds of prey show more aggression, but she seems different." Samuel nodded, understanding exactly what Dr. Wilson meant. There was something special about this eagle, something he couldn't quite put into words. The actual extraction required all of Samuel's port operation expertise. He had to coordinate with the early shift to ensure no containers would be moved in their area, and he personally oversaw the positioning of a small crane that would allow them better access to the trapped bird. Throughout the process, he found himself talking softly to the eagle, explaining each step as if she could understand him. "We're going to help you," he murmured, maintaining eye contact with the magnificent bird. "Just stay calm, and we'll have you out of there soon." To his amazement, the eagle remained relatively still, her eyes fixed on him with an almost human-like comprehension. Dr. Wilson worked with practiced efficiency, carefully examining the wing once they managed to reach her. "The injury isn't as severe as I feared," he announced after a preliminary examination. "Looks like she got caught in something and strained the wing trying to free herself. With proper care and rest, she should make a full recovery." The veterinarian's clinic, as it turned out, was just a few miles from the port, housed in a converted Victorian home with a specialized aviary for recovering birds. As they transported the eagle there, Samuel found himself already planning future visits. He knew he should focus on his work, maintain the professional distance that had defined his life for so long. But something about this eagle had awakened a long-dormant part of his soul. Over the next few days, Samuel found himself spending his lunch breaks at the clinic. Dr. Wilson, impressed by his genuine interest, began sharing his knowledge about eagles, their behaviors, their mating habits, and their incredible ability to form lasting bonds. "Eagles mate for life, you know," he explained one afternoon as they watched the female eat. "They're also incredibly intelligent and can remember human faces for years." The eagle's recovery progressed steadily, and with each visit, Samuel noticed she seemed more responsive to his presence. She would track his movement around the aviary, and when he spoke, she would tilt her head in that characteristic way that made him feel she was truly listening. Dr. Wilson noticed it too, commenting on the unusual bond that seemed to be forming between them. "In all my years of practice," the veterinarian said, watching Samuel feed the eagle carefully prepared pieces of fish, "I've never seen anything quite like this. She treats you differently than anyone else who comes near her enclosure." Samuel found himself sharing details of his life with the eagle during his visits. Simple things about his day, his worries about the port's efficiency ratings, his solitary evenings in his apartment overlooking the water. He knew it might seem strange to others, but in the presence of this majestic creature, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. As the day of release approached, Samuel felt a mixture of joy and sadness. Dr. Wilson had chosen a location near the port for the release, a quiet area where the eagle would have easy access to familiar hunting grounds. "She's ready," the veterinarian declared one morning, "but I have a feeling this won't be the last we see of her." Standing in the early morning light, holding the special transportation cage, Samuel realized how much his life had changed in just a few short weeks. The methodical port supervisor, who lived by rules and regulations, had discovered something far more meaningful than efficient scheduling and perfect safety records. He had found a connection to the wild, untamed spirit that soared above the manufactured order of the port. The morning of the eagle's release dawned clear and crisp, a rarity for Seattle. Samuel arrived at the chosen location just as the sun began painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Dr. Wilson was already there, running through final checks on the eagle's condition. The release site, a quiet clearing overlooking the port, seemed perfect, close enough to familiar territory, but far from the industrial bustle. "Remember," Dr. Wilson cautioned as they prepared for the release, "wild animals aren't pets. Once she's free, she'll follow her natural instincts. Don't be disappointed if she never returns." Samuel nodded, understanding the warning, but feeling somehow that this case might be different. The connection he'd formed with the eagle felt deeper than mere circumstance. The moment of release was both beautiful and heart-wrenching. As Samuel opened the cage door, the eagle hesitated for just a moment, her amber eyes meeting his one last time. Then, with a powerful thrust of her wings, she took to the sky. The sight of her soaring freely, her wingspan magnificent against the morning light, brought unexpected tears to Samuel's eyes. She circled the clearing 3 times, each pass bringing her higher into the sky, before heading toward the waterfront. Samuel watched until she was just a speck against the clouds, then disappeared altogether. The empty feeling in his chest surprised him. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to care about this wild creature. "You did a good thing," Dr. Wilson said, patting Samuel's shoulder. "She's where she belongs now." Samuel knew the veterinarian was right, but returning to his regular routine at the port felt strangely hollow. The early morning inspections, once his favorite part of the day, now seemed to lack something essential. 3 days passed, each morning bringing a small hope that was followed by disappointment. Samuel threw himself into his work, trying to recapture the satisfaction he'd once found in the precise organization of shipping schedules and cargo manifests. His employees noticed the change in him. The usually stoic supervisor seemed more distracted, often pausing to scan the sky during his rounds. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Samuel was checking container seals in the eastern section of the port when a familiar shadow passed over him. His heart leaped as he looked up to see the eagle circling overhead. She made several passes before landing gracefully on a nearby container, her eyes fixed on him with unmistakable recognition. "Hello, old friend," Samuel whispered, hardly daring to believe she'd returned. The eagle preened her feathers, settling onto her perch as if she'd never left. When Samuel had to continue his rounds, she followed, gliding from container to container, maintaining a respectful distance while staying clearly within sight. That evening, Samuel called Dr. Wilson to share the news. The veterinarian was intrigued, but not entirely surprised. "Eagles are incredibly intelligent birds," he explained. "They can remember faces and locations for years. But this level of interaction is unusual. There's something special about your connection with her." Over the next few days, a routine developed. The eagle would appear each morning as Samuel began his inspections, accompanying him on his rounds before disappearing around midday, presumably to hunt. Some afternoons she would return, perching high above the port, her presence a comforting constant in Samuel's working life. Word of the eagle's behavior began to spread among the port workers. Most found it fascinating, even lucky, having such a magnificent bird choose their port as her territory. A few old-timers recalled stories of eagles being considered spiritual messengers in various cultures, bringing wisdom and guidance to those they chose to visit. Samuel began keeping a small cooler in his office with fresh fish, occasionally offering pieces to his feather companion. He was careful to maintain a proper distance, respecting her wild nature while treasuring their unique bond. The eagle never came too close, but her consistent presence and attention to his movements made it clear their connection was far from ordinary. One morning, as Samuel watched her soar above the port, he realized something had fundamentally shifted in his worldview. The rigid boundaries between the organized human world of the port and the wild freedom of nature had begun to blur. In this majestic bird, he'd found a bridge between these two realms, and somehow, that connection was transforming him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The transformation at the port happened so gradually that Samuel barely noticed it at first. It began with a second eagle appearing alongside his regular visitor one crisp morning. This newcomer, slightly smaller but equally majestic, circled cautiously before landing near Samuel's companion. He watched, fascinated, as the two birds seemed to communicate through subtle movements and quiet calls. "Looks like she's found a mate," Dr. Wilson observed when Samuel called to tell him about the development. "It's not uncommon for eagles to form strong pair bonds. What's extraordinary is that she's choosing to share her human connection with her partner." The veterinarian's voice held a note of excitement that matched Samuel's own feelings about this new development. As weeks passed, the pair became a regular fixture at the port. Workers began calling them Samuel's eagles, a name that made him both proud and slightly uncomfortable. He'd never sought attention, preferring to remain in the background, efficiently managing the port's operations. Now, he found himself at the center of an increasingly remarkable situation. The real surprise came when a third eagle appeared, then a fourth. By the end of the month, a small group of eagles had made the port their regular gathering place. Each morning, they would arrive with the dawn, perching on containers and cranes, their keen eyes following Samuel as he made his rounds. The sight was both magnificent and slightly unsettling. Never before had such a large group of eagles been known to gather in an industrial setting. "They're watching over the port like guardians," remarked Maria, one of the crane operators who had worked at the facility for over 2 decades. "In all my years here, I've never seen anything like it. It's like they've adopted us. Or at least they've adopted you, Samuel." The eagles' presence began to affect port operations in subtle ways. Workers moved more carefully, more mindfully, aware of their audience above. Some claimed the accident rate had dropped since the eagles arrived, though Samuel knew this was probably just coincidence. Still, there was something about working under the watchful eyes of these magnificent birds that seemed to inspire greater care and attention. Samuel started researching eagle behavior in his spare time, trying to understand this unprecedented situation. He learned about their social structures, their hunting patterns, and their territorial behaviors. None of the literature mentioned anything about eagles forming such close associations with human activities, especially in an industrial setting. One morning, as Samuel was documenting the daily cargo manifest, his office phone rang. It was Johnson, the port's safety coordinator, requesting an immediate meeting. The tone of his voice made Samuel's stomach tighten. He knew this conversation wouldn't be a pleasant one. "We need to talk about the eagles, Carter," Johnson began as soon as Samuel entered his office. "The board is concerned. Having wild predators regularly gathering at an active port facility raises serious safety and liability issues. We've received complaints from some of the shipping companies." Samuel listened as Johnson outlined the concerns. Potential interference with crane operations, worry about worker distraction, fear of negative publicity if anything were to happen. Each point felt like a personal blow, though Samuel maintained his professional composure. "They're not interfering with operations," he argued carefully. "If anything, they've become a positive presence. Workers are more focused, more careful. And think about the public relations potential. A major industrial port coexisting harmoniously with wildlife. It's a powerful message." Johnson sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand your attachment to these birds, Samuel. Really, Ido. But we're running a business here, not a wildlife sanctuary. The board wants them gone. Find a way to discourage them from gathering here, or we'll have to take more drastic measures." As Samuel left the meeting, he felt the weight of an impossible choice settling on his shoulders. Above him, the eagles soared gracefully between the towering cranes, their presence a testament to the unexpected ways nature could adapt to and enhance even the most industrial of settings. He couldn't bear the thought of driving them away, yet his entire career, his livelihood, now hung in the balance. Walking back to his office, Samuel began to realize that protecting these magnificent birds would require more than just passion. It would need a plan, one that could reconcile the seemingly conflicting needs of commerce and conservation. As he watched the eagles riding the thermal currents above the port, a memory stirred in his mind. Something he'd read about a local biologist who had dedicated his life to studying these magnificent creatures. That evening, unable to sleep, Samuel sat in his apartment overlooking the darkened port, his laptop open to dozens of research tabs about eagles and their behaviors. As he scrolled through articles and studies, one name kept appearing: Dr. Michael Foster, a renowned biologist who had dedicated his life to studying and protecting the eagles of the Seattle region. The more Samuel read about Foster's work, the more fascinated he became. The biologist had spent over 3 decades documenting eagle behaviors, establishing protected nesting sites, and advocating for their conservation. His research had been groundbreaking, particularly his studies on eagle intelligence and their ability to form lasting relationships with specific locations and, remarkably, even with people. A local newspaper article from 5 years ago caught Samuel's attention. It was an obituary for Dr. Foster, describing his passing as a significant loss to the scientific community and to Seattle's wildlife conservation efforts. The article mentioned that his research facility and sanctuary, located just outside the city, was now maintained by his widow, Linda Foster, who continued his work in a smaller capacity. Samuel found himself reading the article several times, particularly the parts describing Foster's unique approach to studying eagles. The biologist had developed special techniques for observing and interacting with the birds, earning their trust while maintaining their wild nature. Many of his observations about eagle behavior seemed to mirror what Samuel was experiencing at the port. Unable to wait until morning, Samuel began searching for more information about Linda Foster and the sanctuary. After several attempts, he found a small website for the Foster Wildlife Research Center, which included a contact form. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he considered what to write. How could he explain his situation without sounding crazy? Finally, he began typing. "Dear Mrs. Foster, my name is Samuel Carter, and I'm the operations supervisor at Seattle's Eastern Port. I've been experiencing something unusual with a group of eagles that I believe might be connected to your late husband's work. I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you about this situation." After reading and rewriting the message several times, Samuel hit send, not really expecting a response. To his surprise, less than an hour later, his phone pinged with an email notification. Linda Foster's reply was brief but intriguing. "Mr. Carter, I've been hearing rumors about the eagles at the port. Perhaps it's time we talked. Can you come to the sanctuary tomorrow morning at 7 a.m.? The next morning, Samuel arrived at the sanctuary just as the sun was beginning to illuminate the surrounding forest. The facility was smaller than he'd imagined. A modest wooden building surrounded by several large aviaries and what appeared to be observation platforms built into the surrounding trees. A sign, weathered but well-maintained, read Foster Wildlife Research Center, dedicated to understanding and protecting nature's messengers. Linda Foster was waiting for him on the front porch, a cup of steaming coffee in her hands. She was older than Samuel had expected, probably in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate him carefully. "You're punctual," she remarked, offering him a slight smile. Michael always said you could tell a person's character by how they respect other people's time. As they sat on the porch, Samuel shared his story, finding the injured eagle, the unexpected bond that formed, and now the growing community of eagles at the port. Linda listened intently, occasionally nodding but otherwise remaining silent. When he finished, she stood up and gestured for him to follow her. "There's something you need to see," she said, leading him into what had clearly been Dr. Foster's office. The room was a testament to a life dedicated to research. Walls lined with photographs of eagles, shelves filled with notebooks, and maps marked with what appeared to be nesting sites and migration patterns. Linda pulled out a worn leather journal from a desk drawer. Michael spent his last years studying a particular group of eagles that exhibited unusual social behaviors. He documented cases of these birds forming complex relationships not just with each other, but with specific locations and even people. She paused, running her hand over the journal's cover. The local wildlife authorities thought his theories were too far-fetched, too anthropomorphic. But Michael knew he was observing something special. As she opened the journal, Samuel's heart skipped a beat. There, carefully sketched on the yellowed pages, were detailed drawings of eagles that looked remarkably similar to the ones that had been visiting his port. The notes beside them described behaviors that perfectly matched what he had been experiencing. Linda carefully turned the pages of Michael's journal, revealing detailed observations, sketches, and photographs that spanned years of research. Samuel leaned closer, fascinated by the meticulous notes that seemed to mirror his own experiences with the port eagles. Michael believed that eagles possess a level of intelligence and social complexity that we've barely begun to understand, Linda explained, pointing to a particular entry. He documented cases of eagles passing down learned behaviors through generations, creating what he called cultural inheritance patterns within specific family groups. The journal entries described a particular group of eagles that Michael had studied intensively in the years before his passing. These birds had exhibited unusual social behaviors, including maintaining multi-generational family groups and returning regularly to specific locations that held no obvious ecological advantage. "Look at this," Linda said, showing Samuel a series of photographs. "These markings on the wings and tail feathers, they're distinct to this family group. And here," she pulled out another photograph, this one more recent, taken by a wildlife photographer at the port. "Your eagles share these same markings." Samuel studied the photographs, his mind racing with implications. "Are you saying the eagles at my port are the same ones your husband studied?" Linda nodded slowly. "Not all of them, but I believe some were descendants of his original study group. Michael called them the Guardian family because of their unusual protective behaviors toward their chosen territories and the people they bonded with." She stood up and walked to a large map on the wall, tracing a line from the sanctuary to the port. This whole area was their traditional territory before urban development pushed them out. The port might seem like an unlikely place for them to gather, but it's actually part of their ancestral range. Samuel shared his concerns about the Port Authority's ultimatum, watching Linda's expression darken. "They can't just drive them away," she said firmly. "These eagles aren't just random birds. They're part of a unique family group that's been in this area for generations. Displacing them could disrupt decades of learned behavior patterns." As they discussed the situation, Linda began pulling out more of Michael's research materials. "My husband had a theory about creating sustainable coexistence between human activities and wildlife. He believed that with proper understanding and accommodation, we could maintain industrial operations while protecting and even benefiting from wildlife presence." She showed Samuel designs for specialized platforms and resting areas that Michael had developed, structures that could be integrated into industrial settings without compromising safety or efficiency. These were never implemented because most businesses couldn't see past their immediate concerns about liability and regulations. "But the port might be different," Samuel mused, studying the designs. "We already have the infrastructure. With some modifications." His mind began working on the logistics, seeing possibilities where before he'd only seen problems. Linda watched him with growing interest. "You remind me of Michael. You know, he had that same look when he was solving a puzzle. But be careful. His passion for these birds cost him more than you might realize." The academic community ridiculed his theories about eagle intelligence and social behavior. They called him a dreamer, said he was anthropomorphizing wild animals. Samuel looked up from the designs, meeting Linda's gaze. What made him continue despite the criticism? A soft smile crossed Linda's face. He used to say that sometimes the truth finds you, and once it does, you have a responsibility to protect it, no matter what others might think. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "The eagles chose you, Samuel, just like they chose Michael. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" As if in response to her words, a familiar cry echoed from outside. They moved to the window to see an eagle, the same one Samuel had rescued, perched on a nearby tree, watching the sanctuary with those intelligent eyes he'd come to know so well. "She followed you here," Linda whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Michael would have loved to see this." She turned to Samuel with renewed purpose. "I think it's time we did something with all this research. Michael's work doesn't have to end with him. Perhaps this is why you were brought into their world." The idea that began forming in Samuel's mind was ambitious, perhaps even impossible, but as he watched the eagle outside and thought about the Port Authority's ultimatum, he knew he had to try. It wasn't just about saving his job anymore. It was about protecting something rare and precious, something that might help bridge the gap between the human and natural worlds. The next few days saw Samuel and Linda working tirelessly to develop a comprehensive plan that would transform the conflict at the port into an opportunity. They spent hours poring over Michael's research, combining his wildlife expertise with Samuel's knowledge of port operations to create something unprecedented. "The key," Linda explained one evening as they reviewed Michael's designs, "is to show the port authorities that the eagle's presence can be more than just a liability. It can be an asset." She spread out a series of architectural drawings that Michael had created, showing innovative structures that could serve both wildlife and industrial needs. Samuel had taken a week of vacation time to focus on the project, something he'd never done in his 15 years at the port. His dining room table had become a command center, covered with maps, blueprints, and environmental impact studies. The wall behind held a large port schematic where they'd marked potential locations for what they were calling integration zones. "Look at these sight lines," Samuel pointed out, tracing paths between container stacks. "If we modify some of the existing structures here and here, we can create safe perching areas that won't interfere with crane operations." The eagles already favor these spots naturally. Linda nodded approvingly. Michael's research showed that eagles prefer certain heights and angles for their perches. If we can provide proper platforms at these key points, we can actually help direct their movement patterns in ways that complement port operations. Their plan went beyond just physical modifications. Samuel had been researching successful wildlife integration programs at other industrial sites around the world. He found cases where the presence of wild animals had actually improved workplace safety and employee morale. When people work in an environment where they feel connected to nature, he explained, they tend to be more mindful and engaged. Linda contributed her expertise on eagle behavior and needs. "These platforms need to be more than just perches," she insisted. "They need to provide the right conditions for observation and rest." Eagles are naturally vigilant creatures. They'll actually help monitor the port area for unusual activity. As they worked, Samuel noticed how Linda seemed to come alive, her eyes sparkling with the same passion he'd seen in the photographs of Michael in his office. "You know," she said one afternoon, "Michael always believed that humans and wildlife could do more than just coexist. They could form mutually beneficial relationships." Most people thought he was being too idealistic. The plan they developed was comprehensive. Specialized platforms integrated into existing structures, designated feeding areas away from critical operations, educational programs for port workers about eagle behavior, and even a proposed wildlife observation area where the public could safely watch the eagles without disrupting port activities. "We need to present this as a pilot program," Samuel suggested. "Something that could potentially be replicated at other ports if successful. That might help convince the board to take a chance on it." One morning, as they were finalizing the proposal, Samuel arrived at the sanctuary to find Linda going through old boxes of Michael's things. She pulled out a camera with a long lens and handed it to him. "Michael used this to document eagle behaviors," she explained. "I think you should have it." Samuel carefully handled the camera, feeling the weight of its significance. "Are you sure?" Linda smiled, her eyes misting slightly. Michael would have wanted his work to continue. "Besides," she added, glancing out the window where several eagles could be seen soaring above the trees, "I think he would have approved of how you're using his research." They spent the next few days gathering photographic evidence of the eagles' current behavior at the port, documenting their flight patterns and preferred perching spots. Samuel used Michael's camera to capture remarkable images of the birds coexisting with port operations, showing how they naturally avoided interference with critical activities. The real breakthrough came when they discovered something in Michael's later journals: detailed observations of how eagles could adapt their behavior based on human activities, essentially learning to navigate around industrial operations while maintaining their natural behaviors. This evidence would be crucial in demonstrating to the port authorities that a cooperative relationship wasn't just possible, it was already happening. As their presentation took shape, Samuel began to feel a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about saving his job or protecting the eagles. It was about proving that progress didn't have to come at the expense of nature. In fact, embracing the natural world might be the key to creating something even better than before. The morning of the presentation to the port's board of directors dawned with an unusual clarity for Seattle. Samuel stood at his apartment window, watching the eagles soaring over the port in their morning ritual, drawing strength from their graceful presence. His presentation folder contained weeks of careful planning, research, and hope. Linda met him at the port entrance, carrying additional materials and looking professional in a blazer that had probably seen many academic presentations during Michael's career. "Remember," she said, squeezing his arm encouragingly, "we're not just presenting a problem solution. We're offering them an opportunity to be pioneers." The boardroom was intimidating, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling port operations below. 12 pairs of eyes focused on Samuel as he began his presentation, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Johnson, the safety coordinator, sat at the far end, his expression carefully neutral. "Ladies and gentlemen," Samuel began, "3 months ago, we viewed the presence of eagles at our port as a potential liability. Today, I'm here to show you how it could become one of our greatest assets." He launched into their carefully prepared presentation, showing slides of Michael's research, current port operations, and their integrated design proposals. Linda took over the wildlife portion, her expertise evident as she explained the eagles' behavior patterns and the potential benefits of their presence. "These aren't just random birds," she emphasized. "They're part of a unique family group that Dr. Foster studied for decades. Their intelligence and adaptability make them perfect partners in this innovative approach to port operations." The board members listened with varying degrees of interest. Some leaned forward, clearly intrigued by the potential publicity benefits of an environmentally progressive port. Others frowned at the projected costs and potential complications. The tension in the room was palpable. "This is all very interesting," interrupted Marcus Reynolds, the head of operations. "But we're running a port, not a wildlife sanctuary. How can you guarantee these birds won't interfere with our operations or cause accidents?" Samuel was prepared for this question. He brought up several charts showing accident statistics since the eagles' arrival. "Actually, our safety record has improved by 12% since the eagles began regularly visiting the port. Workers are more alert, more mindful of their surroundings. Plus," he added, clicking to the next slide, "our security cameras have caught potential trespassers being deterred by the eagles' presence." The presentation continued with detailed plans for the integration zones, safety protocols, and even a marketing strategy that would position the port as a leader in environmental innovation. Linda shared success stories from other industrial sites that had implemented wildlife integration programs, though none quite as ambitious as what they were proposing. "The initial investment would be significant," Samuel acknowledged, addressing the financial concerns head-on. "But the long-term benefits, including improved public relations, potential ecotourism revenue, and enhanced worker satisfaction, would more than offset the costs." The questions that followed were intense and probing. Board members wanted to know about liability issues, insurance implications, worker safety concerns, and potential impact on efficiency. Samuel and Linda handled each query with careful attention, their preparation evident in their detailed responses. As the presentation concluded, the board called for a brief recess to discuss the proposal. Samuel and Linda waited in the hallway, both too nervous to speak. Through the windows, they could see several eagles perched on nearby containers, as if they too were awaiting the decision. When they were called back in, the board's response was unexpected. "We see the potential in your proposal," the chairman began, "but we need more concrete evidence that this can work. We're prepared to offer you a 3-month trial period. If you can demonstrate successful integration without any negative impact on operations, we'll consider implementing the full program." It wasn't the unconditional approval they'd hoped for, but it was a start. However, the chairman wasn't finished. "There are conditions," he continued. "You'll need to maintain normal operational efficiency during this period. Any accidents or delays that can be attributed to the eagles will result in immediate termination of the project." And, he added, looking directly at Samuel, "You'll be personally responsible for overseeing this trial, in addition to your regular duties." The pressure of this responsibility settled heavily on Samuel's shoulders, but he could see the opportunity hidden within the challenge. They had 3 months to prove that their vision of harmony between industry and nature wasn't just a dream. It was a viable future. The 3-month trial period began immediately, and Samuel found himself juggling his regular supervisory duties with the demands of implementing their integration plan. Every morning started an hour earlier than usual as he meticulously documented the eagles' movements and behaviors, using Michael's old camera to capture their interactions with the port environment. Linda had transformed a corner of her sanctuary's office into what she called the Port Project Command Center, complete with daily logs, behavior charts, and a growing collection of photographs. She spent several days a week at the port, working alongside Samuel to monitor progress and adjust their strategies based on the eagles' responses. "Look at this," Linda exclaimed one morning, pointing to a pattern she'd noticed in their documentation. "They're actually creating their own routine around the port schedule. See how they've adjusted their hunting times to avoid the busiest crane operations. Her eyes sparkled with the same enthusiasm that had characterized her late husband's research. The first major test of their project came when a new shipping company began operations at the port. Their massive vessels required different loading patterns, and the change in routine initially seemed to unsettle the eagles. Samuel watched anxiously as the birds circled higher than usual, clearly uncertain about tea. He knew movement patterns below. "Give them time," Linda advised, noting their behavior in her journal. Michael's research showed that eagles are remarkably adaptable. They just need to understand that the new patterns aren't threats. Her confidence proved well-founded when, within days, the eagles had not only adjusted to the new operations, but had found optimal perching spots to observe the changed activity. Worker response to the integration program exceeded their expectations. Many employees began arriving early just to watch the morning ritual of the eagles arriving. Maria, the crane operator who had first noticed the birds' protective presence, started a voluntary log where workers could record their eagle observations, creating an unexpected source of valuable data. "You've got to see this," she told Samuel one afternoon, pulling up a video on her phone. It showed an eagle swooping down to scatter a flock of seagulls that had been causing problems around the waste management area. "They're actually helping us keep the port cleaner. Who needs a pest control service when you have natural guardians?" Not everything went smoothly, however. Some workers remained skeptical, and Samuel occasionally overheard mutterings about wasting time and resources on wild birds. Johnson, the safety coordinator, seemed to be watching especially closely, appearing whenever there was the slightest deviation from normal operations. The real challenge came halfway through the trial period when a major storm system moved into the area. The high winds and heavy rain tested not only port operations, but also the eagles' ability to maintain their presence safely. Samuel and Linda spent tense hours monitoring the situation, ready to implement emergency protocols if necessary. To their amazement, the eagles demonstrated an uncanny ability to adapt to the adverse conditions. They found shelter in the lee of containers and structures, maintaining their watch over the port while staying safe from the elements. Their behavior during the storm provided valuable data for the project, showing how natural intelligence could complement human safety protocols. "This is exactly what Michael theorized," Linda explained, reviewing footage from the storm. He believed that wildlife could develop sophisticated strategies for coexisting with human activities, far beyond what we typically give them credit for. She paused the video on a frame, showing an eagle guiding its younger companion to a sheltered perch. "They're not just surviving here. They're teaching each other how to thrive in this environment." As the trial period's halfway point approached, Samuel organized a progress meeting with the port workers. The session turned into something unexpected when several employees shared personal stories about how the eagle's presence had affected their work experience. One maintenance worker described feeling less stressed during his shifts, while a security guard talked about how the birds had become unofficial partners in monitoring the facility. "It's like they understand what we're trying to do here," the guard said, "and they want to help. I've never felt anything like it in 20 years of work." The positive response from the workers was encouraging, but Samuel knew they still had significant challenges ahead. The board would need more than anecdotal evidence. They needed concrete data showing that the integration program could be sustained without compromising port efficiency or safety. One evening, as Samuel was reviewing the day's documentation, he noticed something remarkable in the photographs. The eagles had begun using the temporary platforms they'd installed in exactly the way Michael's research had predicted, creating a natural surveillance pattern that complemented the port's security system. It was as if they were proving, day by day, that harmony between human industry and natural intelligence wasn't just possible, it was optimal. With just 3 weeks remaining in the trial period, the pressure to prove the project's success intensified. Samuel and Linda had amassed an impressive collection of data, photographs, and testimonials, but they knew the board would require irrefutable evidence that the Eagle integration program was beneficial to port operations. The breakthrough they needed came from an unexpected source. A major international shipping magazine had caught wind of their unique project and sent a reporter to cover the story. The journalist, Sophie Chun, arrived early one morning, her skepticism evident in her initial questions about what she clearly expected to be a well-meaning but impractical environmental initiative. "I've covered dozens of green industrial projects," she told Samuel as they walked through the port. "Most of them are just PR stunts that." Her voice trailed off as she witnessed the morning arrival of the Eagles. The sight of these majestic birds gliding between the cranes and containers, perfectly integrated with the port's operations, left her momentarily speechless. Linda joined them, sharing Michael's research and explaining how his theories about wildlife intelligence were being proven daily at the port. Sophie's skepticism gradually transformed into genuine interest as she observed the sophisticated interaction between the Eagles and port operations. "This isn't just about wildlife conservation," Samuel explained, showing her their documented improvements in efficiency and safety. "It's about finding a better way to run industrial operations. The Eagles have become partners in our work here, not just visitors we tolerate." The reporter spent 3 days at the port, interviewing workers, observing operations, and documenting the Eagles' behavior. Maria, the crane operator, shared her logs showing how the birds had actually helped prevent several potential accidents by their alerting behavior. Security staff demonstrated how the Eagles' presence had significantly reduced problems with trespassing and vandalism. "They're better than security cameras," one guard explained. "Nothing gets past their attention, and just their presence is enough to deter most troublemakers." The article Sophie wrote became a turning point for the project. Published in Global Shipping Today, it presented the port's Eagle Integration Program as a groundbreaking model for industrial environmental cooperation. The piece went viral in industry circles, drawing attention from environmental groups, industrial planners, and even government agencies interested in replicating the program. Linda was particularly moved by how the article highlighted Michael's research. "He would have been so proud to see his theories validated like this," she said, wiping away tears as she read the glowing references to his work. All those years when colleagues dismissed his ideas about wildlife intelligence and human-animal cooperation, he knew he was right. The increased attention brought unexpected benefits. Several environmental organizations offered to provide additional funding and support for expanding the program. A major shipping company expressed interest in implementing similar wildlife integration projects at their other port facilities worldwide. However, the publicity also intensified the pressure on Samuel and Linda. With all eyes on their project, they couldn't afford any mistakes in these final crucial weeks. Johnson, the safety coordinator, seemed more determined than ever to find flaws in their program, scrutinizing every incident report for any sign that the Eagles might be affecting port operations negatively. The Eagles themselves appeared to sense the importance of this period. Their behavior became even more coordinated with port activities, as if they were deliberately demonstrating their ability to coexist harmoniously with industrial operations. The original Eagle that Samuel had rescued was often seen leading this sophisticated dance between nature and industry, her presence a constant reminder of how this remarkable journey had begun. One morning, as Samuel watched the Eagles soaring between the containers, he received an unexpected visit from Marcus Reynolds, the head of operations who had been one of their biggest skeptics. Reynolds stood silently for a while, observing the birds' movements and the smooth flow of port activities below. "You know, Carter," he finally said, "when you first pitched this idea, I thought it was complete nonsense. But watching this," he gestured at the scene before them, "it's like seeing the future of industrial operations. These birds aren't just surviving here, they're making our port better." The completion of the trial period was approaching rapidly, and Samuel knew that everything they'd worked for would be decided in the next few days. The board would review their data, assess the program's impact, and make a final decision about its future. As he prepared their final presentation, Samuel felt the weight of responsibility not just to the port and the Eagles, but to Michael Foster's legacy and the possibility of a new way of thinking about the relationship between industry and nature. The day of the final presentation arrived with unprecedented clarity in the Seattle sky. Samuel stood at the observation deck of the port's administrative building, watching the morning light paint the container yard in shades of gold. The Eagles were already in position, their presence now as much a part of the port's morning routine as the sound of crane engines warming up. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Every seat was filled, not just with board members, but also with representatives from environmental organizations, shipping companies, and even city officials who had taken interest in the project. Linda sat in the front row, clutching a worn leather briefcase that contained Michael's original research journals. 3 months ago, Samuel began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. We stood here proposing what many thought was an impossible dream: the integration of wild eagles into an active industrial port facility. Today, we're here to show you not just the success of that dream, but its transformation into a model for the future of industrial operations. The presentation that followed was compelling in its thoroughness. Samuel presented clear data, showing improvements in port efficiency, worker safety, and security. Maintenance costs had decreased, largely due to the reduced presence of problematic birds that the eagles naturally deterred. Worker satisfaction scores had reached their highest levels in the port's history. Linda then took the floor, presenting the scientific significance of their findings. What we've witnessed here goes beyond simple coexistence, she explained, displaying slides of the eagles' sophisticated behavioral patterns. These birds have developed a complex understanding of port operations, creating a synergy that Dr. Foster theorized was possible but had never been properly documented until now. The room fell silent as they played a professionally edited video compilation of the eagles in action. It showed them warning workers about potential hazards, deterring intruders, and maintaining their watch over the port with an almost supernatural awareness of its rhythms and needs. Maria, the crane operator, had asked to speak, and her testimony proved powerful. "These eagles aren't just birds anymore," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They become our partners, our protectors. They make us feel connected to something bigger than just moving containers around." The questions from the board were probing, but different from their initial skepticism 3 months ago. They wanted to know about expanding the program, about implementation at other ports, about the potential for research partnerships with universities. The tone had shifted from "why should we do this?" to "how can we do more of this?" Then came the moment that changed everything. Marcus Reynolds, who had been quietly observing until now, stood up. "I've spent 30 years in port operations," he began, "and I've seen countless initiatives come and go. But this..." He paused, looking out the window where an eagle soared past. "This is different. This isn't just about environmental responsibility or public relations. What Mr. Carter and Mrs. Foster have shown us is a new way of thinking about industrial operations entirely." He turned to face the board directly. "I propose we not only approve this program permanently, but establish a dedicated department for wildlife integration, with Mr. Carter at its head. Furthermore, I suggest we allocate resources to help other ports implement similar programs." The room erupted in discussion. Board members who had been skeptical now leaned forward with interest. Environmental representatives exchanged excited glances. Linda gripped Samuel's arm, her eyes shining with tears. The board chairman called for order and announced they would take a brief recess to discuss the proposals. As people filed out of the boardroom, Samuel remained by the window, watching the eagles soar between the containers below. One of them, he was sure it was the same one he'd rescued all those months ago, landed on a nearby crane and seemed to look directly at him. Linda joined him, holding one of Michael's journals. "You know what Michael wrote in his last entry?" she asked softly. He wrote, "The future belongs to those who can see the bridge between worlds." He wasn't just talking about eagles and humans. He was talking about finding ways to embrace progress without losing our connection to the natural world. Samuel nodded, understanding now more than ever the significance of what they'd achieved. This wasn't just about saving his job or protecting the eagles. It wasn't even about proving Michael's theories right. It was about showing that there was a better way forward, one that embraced both human innovation and natural wisdom. The chairman's voice called them back into the boardroom. As they took their seats, Samuel felt a strange calm settle over him. Whatever the decision, he knew they had already accomplished something remarkable. They had shown that dreams, no matter how impossible they might seem, could take flight when given the chance to soar. 6 months after the board's unanimous decision to approve and expand the Eagle integration program, the Seattle port had transformed into something unprecedented in industrial history. The once stark landscape of containers and cranes now featured carefully designed platforms and observation points, seamlessly blending industrial efficiency with natural harmony. Samuel stood at his new office window, now the director of Wildlife Integration Programs, watching the morning ritual he had come to cherish. The Eagles arrived with the dawn, spreading out across their designated areas with practiced precision. The original Eagle, whom workers had nicknamed Foster in honor of the visionary biologist, led her growing family in their daily patrol of the port. Linda had become a regular presence at the port, overseeing the research aspects of the program from a new environmental study center established in Michael's name. The old shipping container that housed the center had been converted into a combination of research facility and educational space, its walls covered with Michael's photographs and research findings alongside new discoveries they made each day. "You need to see this," Linda called out one morning, excitement in her voice as she reviewed footage from their new observation cameras. The video showed eagles actually working in concert with port operations in ways they hadn't anticipated, warning of approaching storms before the Weather Service alerts, identifying structural issues in rarely inspected areas, and even helping coordinate the movement of wildlife away from dangerous zones during critical operations. The project's success had rippled far beyond Seattle. Delegations from ports around the world now regularly visited to study their methods. Samuel found himself giving presentations at international conferences, sharing their story, and helping other facilities develop their own wildlife integration programs. The shipping magazine that had first brought attention to their project now referred to it as the Seattle Model, a blueprint for industrial environmental harmony. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from the port workers themselves. The Eagles had become more than just a successful environmental initiative. They had transformed the very culture of the port. Workers spoke of feeling a deeper connection to their work, a sense of being part of something larger than themselves. The barriers between the industrial and natural worlds had begun to blur in the most beautiful way. One crisp autumn morning, Samuel arrived at the port to find an unexpected gathering of workers near the environmental center. Maria, the crane operator who had been one of the program's earliest supporters, was pointing excitedly at one of the highest platforms. There, Foster and her mate had built something unprecedented, a nest. "In all my research with Michael," Linda whispered, tears in her eyes as she watched through binoculars, "we never documented eagles nesting in an industrial setting like this. They're not just visiting anymore, Samuel. They're making this their home." The news of the nest spread quickly through the port community and beyond. Environmental researchers arrived to document this unprecedented behavior, and media outlets picked up the story as a symbol of hope for the future of industrial environmental cooperation. But for Samuel, it meant something more personal, a sign that the trust he had shown in that first moment of compassion had been repaid in ways he could never have imagined. As he watched Foster tend to her nest, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them here. What had started as a simple act of kindness toward an injured bird had grown into something that was changing how the world thought about the relationship between industry and nature. Michael Foster's dream of finding harmony between these seemingly opposed worlds hadn't died with him. It had taken flight in ways even he might not have imagined. The port had become more than just a facility for moving goods. It was now a living laboratory for a new kind of progress, one that recognized the wisdom and worth of the natural world. The Eagles weren't just visitors or even partners. They had become teachers, showing how adaptation, intelligence, and cooperation could bridge the divide between human enterprise and natural wisdom. Linda joined Samuel at his office window, watching as the morning sun illuminated the port. Below them, workers went about their duties under the watchful eyes of their avian guardians. "You know," she said softly, "Michael used to say that true progress isn't about conquering nature, but learning to dance with it." She smiled as an eagle soared past their window. "I think we're finally learning the steps." Samuel nodded, understanding now that what they had created was more than a program or a policy. It was a testament to the possibility of change, a living proof that with courage, compassion, and vision, even the most unlikely dreams could take flight. As he watched the eagles soaring between the containers and cranes, their wings catching the morning light, he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing story of how humans could learn to share their world with the wild wisdom that had always been there, waiting to be recognized.